Episode 20, AD 1356 to 1414. Through the 1300s, Latin Christendom had been fracturing, for decades descending into internal warfare on an ever grander scale, as its material base became richer, and as its greater princes gathered ever more power to themselves. Conflict between the princes was mirrored by factionalism within the church, up to its highest levels. By 1378 it had split in what is known as the Great Schism. Internal conflict had been perennial and ubiquitous during the heyday of the Crusades in the 1100s and 1200s. But this had the character of low-level, small-scale mayhem and feud. By the 1300s, Western society had become more integrated, become more wealthy and sophisticated. Accordingly, its internal power struggles, conforming to the model proposed by Norbert Elias, were now systemic in reach and on a grand scale. This paralyzing disunity was ill-timed. For in the east, already in 1365, the Turks had outflanked Constantinople and in a spectacular démarche had taken Adrianopolis. By 1369 they had fortified the Greek city and made it their capital, on the European mainland, calling it Edirne. Constantinople was left largely to look to its own defences, something, by this date, it was increasingly incapable of doing. In this episode, we trace the spreading of the civil war within Europe and see how it played into the event which culminated in the splitting of the Western Church, which in turn released even more deeply embedded motives of conflict, the motives of all-destroying and irresolvable religious conflict. The kernel of the huge and spreading civil war in the Occident lay in the northwest, in northwestern France, in a long chain of dreary events alternating between major campaigns, rare climactic battles which resolved nothing, followed by a general state of pillaging, rapine and destruction, which we call the 100 Years' War. As we have seen, developments in battlefield tactics had brought to the forefront formations of massed infantry, crossbowmen and archers. This cutthroat mercenary rabble was paid for the duration of the campaign if funds were available, and otherwise was allowed to pillage at will. Some of the great lords paid their own mercenary bands, but gradually these bands became private enterprises, led and paid by some great adventurer captain, as they were called, and available for hire to anyone who could pay. The phenomenon of the companies spread like the pestilence, and became as endemic as the pestilence, whose recurrence they alternated with. They were a new factor which added massively to the destabilization of Latin Christendom, and helped generalize its various regional conflicts in one great maelstrom of destruction and cruelty. Somewhat miraculously, the Western Empire escaped the contagion for most of this time. This empire had shrunk in the previous century to what we consider today as Germany, but in fact it extended its sphere of influence northwards to the Hansa in the Baltic and to Scandinavia generally, as it did to Bohemia, Hungary, and Poland. The Western, the Holy Roman Empire, in its sustained equilibrium between its constituent principalities, provided a remarkable buffer against the wars spreading in the west and in the south. The Iberian and Italian peninsulas were not immune from the contagion of the companies, however. In Spain, most of which had so recently been reconquered from Islam, the retreat of the Saracens to the redoubt of Granada had the effect of dissolving the glue which had held the northern Christian kingdoms together against them. There was a showdown between the two most powerful kingdoms, between Castilla and Aragon, in the war known to Spanish historiography as La Guerra de los Dos Pedros, the War of the Two Peters, these being Pedro I, the Cruel, and of Castile, and Pedro IV, the Ceremonious of Aragon. Aragon had a maritime empire composed of Valencia, the Balearic Islands, with a footing in Sicily and southern Italy. Nevertheless, by 1356 things were going very badly for them, especially as the Castilian fleet was able to ravage the coast of Valencia and Catalonia. In a shrewd move in 1364, Pedro of Aragon allied himself to the exiled bastard brother of his enemy, Pedro of Castile, who was Enrique de Trastamara, who brought in an army of the feared Compañías Blancas, the White Companies, under Bertrand de Guesclin, from France, and swept all before them. The Castilian nobility too supported Enrique, and ousted King Pedro the Cruel, and crowned Enrique Trastamara as King of Castile instead. This founded the long-lasting Trastamara dynasty, which ruled Castile continuously, and from 1412 Aragon also, until the Habsburgs inherited the whole lot in 1504. Pedro the Cruel of Castile did not give up, but fled to Bayonne in southwest France and allied himself there with none other than Edouard de Woodstock, the Black Prince. Thus the restricted regional competition in Spain drew in both sides of the 100 Years' War, in their spare time, so to speak. Edouard's vast possessions in northern England made him a prince in his own right, so long as he kept within the terms of his fealty sworn to his liege lord, King of England. He could pursue his own foreign policy however he chose. In return for his military might, Pedro gave Edouard lands in the Rioja region, now famous for its lusty red wines, which he invaded in 1367. Typically, he was unable to pay his mercenaries long enough to hold his new possessions. He had to contend with the fact that the Castilian fleet at that time was the most powerful in the Bay of Biscay, Biscaya, and in the English Channel also, even venturing up the Thames on occasion. We should keep in mind that in the Middle Ages the top players in politics, the emperors, kings, dukes, and counts, were often distant or not so distant relatives of one another. By the same token, they were also in inescapable competition with each other. Territorial expansion was a do-or-die imperative. Expansion, the acquisition of new realms, could happen in one of two ways, in battle or in bed, through conquest or through inheritance. Young men did the fighting, young women did the marrying, bedding, and production of heirs with good title. Poets made much, perhaps too much, use of metaphors about bed and battles, drawn swords, and sweet surrenders. Festivities among the Burgundian nobility, involving the siege of the Castle of Love, summed up in frivolous form what politics were about. And so it was that King Juan I of Castile attempted to press his claim to the throne of Portugal through his wife's legitimate title. He obtained the willing support of the Portuguese landed magnates, but he was repulsed by the cities, who in the countryside mobilized the support of the lesser nobility and knights. And so in 1385 the Cortes of Coimbra turned to someone with good reputation as a pious champion of Christendom, and elected as their king the Grand Master of the Orden de Avis, the crusading knights canons founded in 1166, Juan de Avis. The new Avis king of Portugal was in alliance with the Plantagenets, winning in 1385 the victory of Aljubarrota against Juan I of Castile, and thereby consolidating Portugal as a political community distinct from Spain. The great English historian Hugh Trevor Roper said that in this act the merchant oligarchs of the city of Lisbon absorbed, he says, the feudal magnates and were not absorbed by them, thereby laying the political basis for the later dynamism of Portugal as the first global maritime power. However, the Castilian-French alliance paid off later when in 1402 the Norman warlord Jean de Betancourt, in the name of the King of Castile, led a party of knights to sail out into the great ocean to occupy the Islas Canarias, the Canary Islands, the great tourist destination of today. This was the first link in a fateful chain of events. The aboriginal chieftains of the islands experienced the first example of Castilian overseas colonialism, where later slave-worked sugar plantations were established. This was an innovation of Muslim society, copied by the Christians from the plantations they had found when they reconquered Sicily and Crete. This was a significant step out into the Atlantic, into previously little-known regions. Need we note that in the High Middle Ages people in fact did not believe that the world was flat, that if you sailed west you would literally fall off, as countless cartoons and children's books have repeated. Exactly 90 years later, the Canary Islands were to be the launchpad of 3 Castilian ships, the Santa Maria, Niña and Pinta, captained by the genuine Cristoforo Colombo, heading out into the furthest ocean in earnest. The companies, spilling over from the wars in northern France, also provided the destructive impetus in Italy, where they first appeared between 1320 and 1340. During the 1360s, in truces in the 100 Years' War, they inundated Italy in force. For example, the Provençal company, led by Fra Moriale, an ex-mendicant monk, spilled into northern Italy with its swarming camp of followers of merchants, servants, women and children, its efficient treasury and its embryonic internal justice system, as a kind of peripatetic pirate state. Quote, in the absence of a strong political authority able to limit the sacking and prevent the unrestrained mercenaries from attacking cities and small populated centres, it was central Italy which felt most acutely the negative effects and devastation wrought by the companies. Maria Nadia Covini. As Miss Covini notes, quote, the principal powers which fed the growth of the free companies and their degeneration was, without doubt, the papacy, which put a large number of mercenary bands in the field and recruited others to oppose the former. End quote. This process began in the 1350s when the papacy at Avignon commissioned a redoubtable Spanish cardinal to take measures to recover the Avignonese pope's sovereignty in the Papal States. Egidio Albanoz was of the high nobility and studied canon law at Toulouse, and soon rose to become Archbishop of Toledo, and in 1340 joined the royal entourage of King Alfonso XI of Castile in his crusade against the Moors. At the Battle of Rio Salado, his quick action saved the king's life. However, the coming to the throne of Pedro the Cruel, whose cruelty the archbishop reprimanded, led to his fall from royal grace. He left for Avignon in 1350. Since making a temporary stopover there in 1305, the popes had remained, as it was much safer and more stable than living in a Rome beset by political instability, occasioned by the Roman magnates' privatization of power. Archbishop Albanoz came to an Avignon where the papacy was undergoing a gradual metamorphosis. Avignon gave the Curia security and a fixed seat. They had been relocating around the cities of central Italy for decades, and it made them sedentary. With this sedentariness came better organization. The papal monarchy became more of an administrative, jurisdictional, and fiscal fact. The administration of the church became centralized, quote, as was shown by a much more regular taxation and the reservation of the vast majority of important benefices to the Pope's own appointment, end quote, from Barraclough. Particularly revenue effective were the annates, from the Latin annata, a year's proceeds from the first year after a bishop's appointment to his see. The prelatal personnel of the papal court were now mainly drawn from the ranks of university-trained jurists with legal expertise and its accompanying mentality. But nevertheless, popes were elected who were theologians or had a monastic background outside the Curia, such as Urban V, who was a Dominican abbot of the monastery of Saint-Victor at Marseille. Much has been made of the corruption of the Curia at Avignon, and it was once axiomatic to say that the papacy there was at the beck and call of the French kings. In fact, that the Avignon papacy was French in some national sense. Wealthy the Curia certainly was. Clement VI spent 8,000 florins a year on livery, that is, clothes, for his own household. One particular cardinal required 51 houses to accommodate his entourage. It is easy in retrospect to see all this as flagrant clerical corruption. There were many who saw it as such at the time, but we should look at an historical situation as an open project facing into a yet unknown future. Since the 300s AD, as we have abundantly seen, the Christian prelacy, by which I mean the bishops, abbots, and higher ecclesiastics, had largely been drawn from the aristocracy, and they had always lived as great seigneurs, as spiritual lords in their own communities, with all the physical comforts and luxuries that their times afforded. It was an aspect of their dignity which was not, until the 1300s, seen as inappropriate for an exponent of the Christian message. The whiff of corruption arose from Avignon fundamentally because the wealth of Western society now meant that high social status entailed quite a massive accoutrement of relatives, courtiers, officers, servants, horses, residences, and all the rest of it. Of the newly elaborated papal revenues from all over Christendom being brought to Avignon by the cartload, the Curia of Cardinals received a full half for their expenses of state. I use the word in its archaic sense, meaning their exercise of an authority with its trappings of dignity. Great occasions were marked by receptions and banquets. One of the cardinals hosted Clement VI to a banquet of 27 courses. It was this same Clement whose study in the palace is now called the Stag Room, on account of the wonderful frescoes still visible there, depicting the mundane pleasures of a great seigneur, hunting and fishing. I find that these images have the feeling and style that, to use our accustomed terms, is neither medieval nor Renaissance, but they are a perfect blend of both, of the contemporary art of northern Italy and southern France. I say southern France because it is important to distinguish, still at this period, between the north and the south of what we call France. Politically, the papal curia did come under severe pressure from the northern French monarchy, most spectacularly so under Philippe le Bel. But that episode and its aftermath of cowed prudence by the curia occurred before the move to Avignon. Of course, the Valois kings at Paris were seen by all as the most powerful princes in Christendom, and it was obvious that the papacy and curia would take great care in their relations with them. But in all essentials, the papacy remained an independent ecclesiastical and seigneurial institution throughout the 7 decades when it was at Avignon. The popes, as we shall see, operated their own independent foreign and domestic policies and put their own armies in the field. They took no side, though they could have, in the crucial conflict on their northern doorstep, the 100 Years' War. All of the Avignon popes understood themselves as neutral and as uninterested brokers of peace between the houses of the Plantagenets and Valois, slogging out the 100 Years' War. And that is how they were perceived by the combatants themselves. It is said that self-evidently the 7 popes there were all Frenchmen. Not at all. These popes, Clement V, John XXII, etc., were from southern France, from the Auvergne, Aquitaine, and especially from the area of the south then known as the Limousin, around Limoges, from where we get our word limousine, a long automobile. Indeed, in the Curia, the Limousin cardinals constituted a faction all of their own, a nation, a nation, as they said. They spoke the southern language called Occitan in the 19th century, the Languedoc, not northern French. What existed at Avignon was a prelatal establishment, a body of powerful cardinals, each with his own pyramid of underlings, who were comfortable in their homeland, that is the Languedoc, and who enjoyed its mild climate, its fine wines, who valued the ease of communications with the rest of Europe, and who, above all, feared and dreaded a life amid the danger, malaria, and political anarchy of Rome and of Italy generally. This establishment exerted the force of institutional inertia, causing the papal court to remain at Avignon for as long as it did. The real origin of the accusations of Frenchness arose, already during the 1300s, from the profound anger felt in northern Italy that the papacy had abandoned its rightful place at Rome. The Old Testament idea of a Babylonian captivity was first applied in the 1360s to the Avignon papacy by Petrarca in his Canzoniera dell'Empia Babilonia, poetically formulating an image of a papacy and indeed of a people abducted by a great foreign power, implying thereby the Re di Francia, the King of France. On this allegorical basis, as with so much else in our cultural heritage, generations from the Reformation through the Enlightenment and since have built the edifice of their antipathy. Meanwhile, at Avignon, there was a discreet abandonment of papal pretensions to the temporal governance of Christendom, a major development from the days of the investiture conflict to the heady assertions of Boniface VIII in 1302, which goes largely unnoticed. Everywhere the popes came to compromises with the great princes of the West, clarifying their ecclesiastical authority, but comprehensively conceding political authority to their princes. The papacy was narrowing its focus and concentrating on achieving a systematic authority over its own organization, the Church, and by extension over the Papal States in central Italy. To onlookers, it seemed the Church was becoming a more powerful edifice with ever more far-reaching secular and financial interests. As its luxury grew in line with that of all the princely courts in Europe in the 1300s, so did its nepotism, its elaborate schemes of simony, and its systematization of the regular fees for legal and spiritual services. It was becoming ever more effective in getting its money. The papacy of John XXII from 1316 to 1334 brought this new type of church to full elaboration. He issued a constitution execrabilis, eliminating all plurality of benefices, the holding of multiple income-earning ecclesiastical posts by one person. Those benefices which were left over from this cleanup through consolidation defaulted back to the Pope's own disposal. He systematized the new tact of the annates, already mentioned, and he created a formidable administration of jurisdictional and fiscal apparatus. Quote, the papal curia was reorganized, new ordinances of the greatest detail were drawn up for the chancery, the law courts, and other offices, and the payments to the chancery, formerly for work done, were transformed into chancery taxes, graded according to the value to the recipient of the concession being made. End quote. The papacy, and with it the Church, was very gradually, to most people imperceptibly, corroding the basis of its spiritual standing and its religio-social legitimacy. While its involvement in every aspect of social and personal life throughout Christendom remained overwhelming, nevertheless, by 1300 there began to emerge among elements of educated society a determined movement of criticism, and soon there appeared a systematic and eruditely argued program for a root and branch reform of the Church and, above all, of the papacy. Early examples of the changing attitude can be seen in several great intellectual critiques of the papacy that were published in the early 1300s. Among the first was a series of writings by Dante Alighieri, the renowned author of La Divina Commedia, the Divine Comedy. In 1302, his faction at Florence was defeated and he had to go into exile. There he wrote De Monarchia, 1313, a forthright tract in favor of the legitimacy of the imperial title as the supreme authority in Italy, and by extension in Christendom as a whole. The same themes show through in Il Convivio and in the Divina Commedia itself. He called for the restriction of the sphere of the papacy to spiritual and religious matters only. Some years later, in 1326, the physician and theologian at the University of Paris, Marsilius of Padua, published Defensor Pacis, Defender of the Peace, which was a remarkable attempt to think through the implications of a reform of European society in the light of principles which are republican in inspiration. Quote, I believe that for the sufficiency of civil life it is absolutely better for the Commonwealth that each monarch be named by a new election rather than by hereditary succession. For this method will always, or with rare failures, operate to yield the best possible ruler, either a perfect one or at least an adequate one. For by the election of the human legislator, the common benefit of the citizens is always aimed at and achieved, rarely failing. End quote. Marsilius, or Marsilio, had come of age in the political milieu of the northern Italian city republics and his own city of Padua, and in his thought projected their rational spirit and institutions onto the larger canvas of Christendom as a whole. Marsilio not only called for the separation of the Church from secular affairs, but he explicitly argued for the subordination of the Church as a department of secular government. Quote, it is necessary for the peace of the city, or polity, that every bishop, priest, and clergyman be subject to the coercive judgment of the rulers in accordance with human law. End quote. Another strident opponent of the Avignon papacy emerged in far-off Oxford in England. A doctor of divinity there, John Wycliffe, became increasingly bold from 1374 onwards. While people like Dante and Marsilio di Padua aligned themselves with the supreme secular authority of the Western emperors, figures on the periphery often tended to identify with the interests of their own local sovereign, which was Wycliffe's reflex also. He was on the board of advisors to the English crown on framing a response to Pope Urban V, who was asking for the resumption of the payments of feudal dues to the papacy for the holding of the kingship of England, which had been formally ceded by King John in 1214. Similarly to Marsilio di Padua, Wycliffe called for the reform of the papacy, that it should completely extract itself from worldly affairs and solely concern itself with spiritual and religious matters. But where Marsilio proposed a secular, republican solution, Wycliffe pointed up a discrepancy in spirit as to the content of the New Testament and what was the practice and style of the Avignon papacy. This style of synchronic thinking, setting 30 AD with 1360 AD, was to have an explosive and long-term future. To return to the career of our now Cardinal Egidio Albornoz. In 1353, Pope Innocent VI issued a bolla, or decree, appointing Albornoz as Vicario Generale Terrarum et Provinciarum Romanae Ecclesiae in Italiane Partibus, that is, Vicar General of the lands and provinces of the Roman Church in Italy. He was given plenipotentiary powers to regain for the papacy all of the Patrimonium Sancti Petri, the patrimony of St. Peter, which approximately was the original dog-leg-shaped formation from Ravenna in the Romagna, across Umbria and down through Latium to Rome. The papacy had been fighting over this territory since the Lombard invasion of the 600s AD. Before and during the absence of the popes in Avignon, this whole region on either side of the Apennines, although still nominally under papal suzerainty, had fallen into the hands of any local lord who held the signoria, or power, over a formidable, strong-walled hilltop city. The result was a situation of all-round anarchy, that is, of regional warfare in a highly complex struggle for princely survival. Into this maelstrom entered the cool-headed Albornoz, leading a small mercenary army, but equipped with a mandate from heaven to retake its own. Looked at in modern terms, of a man entrusted with a job to do, his execution of that mandate over the following 14 years was a set-piece example of managerial competence. If you believe that the Middle Ages were a time of strong-headed fanaticism and comprehensive irrationality, take a look at the execution of this carefully thought-through strategy by Cardinal Albornoz between 1353 and 1367. He had two great advantages: a claim to legitimacy and a source of a lot of money from Avignon. This is why the Avignon popes pushed so hard to tap every source of revenue throughout Western Christendom. They had, besides the required pomp at their palace at Avignon, some extremely expensive wars to fight. Employing the mercenary bands available, Albornoz first assured himself of the support of the important powers of Archbishops Giovanni Visconti of Milan and the bishops of Pisa, Florence, and Siena. Then he unleashed his military campaign against the most flagrant offender, Giovanni di Vico, prefect of Rome and signore of Viterbo, and usurper of a vast part of the papal territories. Giovanni di Vico met the cardinal's mercenaries on the 10th of March 1354 at Orvieto and was crushed. To the annoyance of the Pope, his employer, Albornoz granted the governorship of Corneto for the following decade to Giovanni as an officer of the Pope. This moderation, when victorious, was a crucial feature of his approach. Subordinate, but do not inflict an injury so great as to incite a desperate revenge. Perhaps Machiavelli would have approved. Albornoz gave his support to the reinstatement of the revolutionary Cola de Rienzo as senator of Rome, effectively making him its master. This in itself is a fascinating episode, which we don't have the time for here. In 1840, Richard Wagner used Cola di Rienzo's reincarnation as a 19th century Republican hero to compose his first opera, Rienzi. Albornoz then turned his attention to regaining control of the March of Ancona and of the Romagna across the Apennines, assuring himself once again of allies. He then attacked the Signori of Rimini, the famous Malatesta brothers. The Malatesta replied by allying themselves with their bitter enemy, Francesco Ordelaffi of Forlì. The Malatesta were defeated by Albornoz's condottiero general, Rodolfo da Varano, and brought into submission, becoming pontifical allies. That left only Francesco Ordelaffi, egged on by his bellicose wife, Marzia degli Ubaldini. In 1356, the Pope in Avignon proclaimed a formal crusade against the Ordelaffi couple. It was preached across Europe. By the 4th of July 1359, Francesco Ordelaffi's financial resources for continuing the struggle were exhausted. He sued for peace. On the same day, Cardinal Albornoz entered Forlì and set up his court in the Palazzo del Comune itself, in an act of high symbolism of exactly who was now in charge. Francesco was given an honourable sinecure in the pontifical system. Through the 1360s, Albornoz set about a massive building program of fortresses, occupying the highest point in a string of cities, forming a strategic spine through the length of the papal territories. Many of these fortresses, the Rocche Pontificale, remain intact and can be visited today in cities like Viterbo, Spoleto, Narni, and Assisi. In 1367, Pope Urban V made the journey from Avignon to Rome. Albornoz greeted him at Viterbo, but died before his master could enter in all security into his own city. Why did Guillaume de Grimoire, a native of the wilder regions of the Auvergne, and the same Pope, by the way, who had requested the feudal fee from the King of England, spurring Wycliffe to revolt, why did he, as Pope Urban V, return to Rome? He came in the first instance to celebrate the reception of the Roman Emperor of Constantinople. Ioannis V Palaiologos, into the Latin Roman Church. Desperate for aid from the West, the emperor made the 2-year journey in the hope of mobilizing the Latins by his personal submission to papal primacy, but not that of his church. In a great ceremony on the steps of Old St. Peter's, he genuflected 3 times before Urban, seated on a throne, and kissed the Pope's feet, hands, and mouth. Then they all entered into the basilica where the Pope celebrated Mass. A grand dinner for the Greek emperor was held that evening in the papal palace. But Urban V had also come to Rome because the Avignon popes had remained in that city through a kind of lethargy prompted by timidity. They had not returned to Rome in 1305 because they lacked the power to ensure their own security. Through bleeding the Western prelacy of revenues for years, and by the astuteness of Albornoz, they had, by 1367, apparently secured that great goal. There was a general sentiment, even at Avignon, that they might indeed return to the Eternal City. The usual explanation given of the Great Schism of the Western Church, for that is what we are now approaching, is that it was a case of the papacy at Avignon being the plaything of the kings of France, because, as we all know, Avignon is in modern France. The popes and the majority of the cardinals there were, as they say, Frenchmen. Due to the rise of nationalism, that word again applied 5 centuries too early, these Frenchmen clashed with their Italian counterparts for possession of the papal office and so on. But there is another view, that the Great Schism of 1378 was the outcome of the continued struggle for central Italy, and it was also the result of the opposing magnetic pulls of the 2 religio-ecclesiastical cities of Rome and Avignon. Let us take the continued struggle for central Italy first. In the aftermath of Albornoz's reconquest of the Papal States, the major opponent to the papal interest emerged from the Duchy of Milan in the persons of Bernabo and Galeazzo Visconti. The terrifying company under the command of the English condottiero Giovanni Acuto was in the papal employ. His Italian name came from the French mispronunciation Acud for Sir John Hawkwood. Of interest for the future is that he took on the services of a rising member of the lesser nobility of the Romagna, Alberico da Barbiano, whose family had Carolingian antecedents. Alberico learned much about warfare from the great and utterly ruthless English condottiero. But the steady successes of the papal cause triggered dark thoughts in the remaining independent cities of Tuscany and Lombardy, among the educated minds of the Signoria of Florence above all. The atmosphere generally in Italy was saturated with resentment that the papacy resided not in Rome, its rightful place, but in a faraway land in Provence. That this was causing much economic hardship in northern Italy, and above all, a loss of birthright, the birthright of Italy to be the foremost land of Christendom on account of the supreme dignity of the papacy residing there. Petrarca, as we have seen, had felt the sting intimately. He had responded by finding as great a glory in Italy's ancient but glorious past as the centre of the Roman Empire. He discovered the glory of ancient classical literature and founded the immensely influential cultural movement of European classicism. But the ordinary people of Italy had more direct experience and resentment. Throughout the cities of the Papal States, they found themselves governed by the great prelates from across the Alps, who let loose among them, even in times of peace, the viscerally hated companies, especially the Bretons from Brittany. The papacy at Avignon had been subject to a vigorous and systematic religious and moral critique. The odour of rank prelatal corruption clung to the cardinals and legates who made up the Avignon establishment, in Italy just as it did in Bohemia and in England. In 1374, the Florentine Signoria, led by Carluccio Salutati, were struggling to deal with an outbreak of famine in the countryside. They sent a delegation to the papal legate at Bologna to request a purchase of grain from him. He point-blank refused. This was received in Florence as a deliberate, hostile act. The undercurrent of the extreme wing of the Franciscan movement for clerical poverty, the heretically condemned Fraticelli, came strongly to the surface. The Florentine Signoria took fright when Hawkwood's company shifted its theatre of operations into southern Tuscany. Letters were sent to most of the cities of northern Italy, including every one within the Papal States, inciting them to throw off the corrupt and oppressive rule of Avignon and ally themselves under Florence's leadership to undo the work of Albornoz. Florence allied itself with its old enemy, Milan. Very quickly, the list, overtly in alliance against the papacy or revolting against its rule, comprised almost every city north of Rome. Florence bought off Hawkwood with an immense payment and a pension, giving him a magnificent Renaissance-style equestrian portrait in the very nave of the Duomo, the Basilica of Santa Maria del Fiore in Florence. Pope Gregory XI responded by giving the Archbishop of Geneva, Robert de Genève, someone whom we would qualify as Swiss, the command of the Breton companies in Italy. He used them ruthlessly. The war escalated. Church revenues from Florence and the allied cities were blocked and used to fund the war. The Pope placed the city of Florence under the interdict. No masses, baptisms, confessions, marriages, or burials, and every man, woman, and child was excommunicated. Gregory was clearly very angry. The religious rebellious side of the war came more into the foreground. The Avignon regime was demonized. Fervid religious processions, complete with flagellants, took place in the streets of Florence as the populace united. Heretical Fraticelli friars now openly appeared among them. By the way, this phenomenon of republican solidarity melding with religious millenarianism was to reappear in Florence over a century later in the High Renaissance, under the leadership of Fra Savonarola. To top it off, the committee at the Florentine Signoria running the war, originally called Le Otto della Guerra, the Eight of the War, were hailed as Le Otto Santi, the Eight Saints. The war became known to history as La Guerra degli Otto Santi, the War of the Eight Saints. In 1377, Archbishop Robert of Geneva's Breton companies, under Hawkwood, besieged and took the Romagnan city of Siena, a member of the anti-papal Florentine League, and as a punishment unleashed the Bretons upon the defenseless population. Some 4,000 men, women, and children were massacred, and the city was burned to the ground. For this, the Reverend Archbishop, later anti-Pope Clement VII, earned himself the sobriquet in Italy of Il Boia di Cesena, the executioner of Cesena. In these circumstances, a young woman at Siena was rapidly coming to prominence for her demonstrations of extreme piety, one Caterina Bonincasa. She enters our story because she played a crucial role in persuading Pope Gregory XI to return from Avignon to Rome, an event which inadvertently precipitated the Great Schism of the Latin Church. She was also expressive of the pitch to which the religious sentiment of the times could rise. Anyone thinking about the phenomenon of the Renaissance should keep this clearly in mind. Caterina had been named after the Greco-Roman saint Catherine of Alexandria, Floriat, about 310 AD, who had been martyred under Emperor Maximinus II. As part of the cultural background here, we should note that in the mid-1300s, the Confraternity of Sant'Andrea at Perugia had put on a liturgical drama of the life of St. John the Baptist, which climaxed with that saint's beheading. A fresco of St. Catherine, despite the 3-century time gap between them, holding the severed head of the Baptist, by the great Ambrogio Lorenzetti, could be seen by Caterina in a local Sienese church. And about this time at Siena, a 3-day-long play of the life of St. Catherine was performed in public by another local confraternity. The confraternities were pious lay organizations which played a prominent role as intermediaries between the citizens and the sacred life of the city, which otherwise was supervised by the clergy. Anyone seeking to understand urban life in the later Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and later should not neglect the study of them. Some of the confraternities specialized in comforting condemned prisoners, called conforteriae, the bodies of comforters. You can see the chapel of one of these organizations today in the back lanes of Avignon. The drama of religious martyrology, performed on a stage in the public piazza, had a remarkable parallel, as Kathleen Falvey has observed, with the very real and immensely bloody public executions that took place on similar wooden structures, sometimes in the same piazza. Indeed, a scaffold, in Shakespeare's English, could mean a stage for the performance of drama or a platform for executions. In 1375, Catherine, soon to become Saint Catherine of Siena, personally comforted the condemned Niccolò di Toldo in the manner of a one-woman conforteria. The confraternities were, of course, male organizations. On the morning of the execution, she waited for him at the place of justice. Before he arrived, she herself mounted the scaffold and placed her own head on the block. As she later told her biographer, Raimondo de Capua, quote, "Then he arrived as meek as a lamb, and seeing me he began to laugh, and he wanted me to make the sign of the cross. When he received the sign, I saying, 'Come on, to the nuptials, sweet brother, for soon you will be in life without end,' he got down with great meekness, and I stretched out his neck, and leaning down I reminded him of the blood of the Lamb. His mouth said nothing but Jesus and Catherine, and as I was saying thus, I received his head in my hands, closing his eyes on divine goodness, and saying, 'I want this,'" end quote. As she knelt before the block, she must have been deluged with the poor man's gushing blood. This type of attitude, in less extreme forms, was a very real and present facet of the life of Italian cities of the 1300s and 1400s, and indeed of the 1500s, that does not feature in our accounts of the Renaissance. Grotesque as this phenomenon of the conforteria certainly is to our sensibilities, we might also consider that it represented a leap in moral consciousness, a sympathetic identification with the perspective of the condemned person, and a viewing of him in some kind of essence as a good man, as someone who, utterly forgiven, would immediately be restored into the eternal bliss of heaven. It was, I am persuaded, the moral origin from which, over many centuries, at least a section of Western civilization began to reject the death penalty. To my knowledge, such qualms concerning the death penalty are simply absent from other major civilizations. It was not to be until 1764 that Cesare Bonesana, the Marquis of Beccaria, would write the first comprehensive rejection of the death penalty in his De Delitti e delle Pene, on crimes and punishments, and it was not to be until after the Second World War that Europe would embrace this revulsion. Through such circuitous routes and over such very long periods, the moral breakthroughs of the Middle Ages have provided the very premises upon which we stand today. Without them, we would be different people. Through her actions and her eloquent prose, Caterina soon came to have a reputation as a living saint far beyond Siena, Tuscany, or even Italy. She wrote repeatedly to Pope Gregory XI and even led an embassy from the government of Florence to Avignon to try to find a solution to the War of the Eight Saints. but the constant theme of her letters was the urgent necessity of the Pope to return to Rome. Here she is writing to him, quote, "O me, my sweet father, with this sweet hand I pray you, and say to you that you should come to defeat our enemies. On behalf of Christ crucified, I say, don't allow yourself believe the counsels of the demon who wants to impede the holy and good proposition. Be, for my sake, a virile man, not a timorous one. Respond to God, who asks that you should come to hold and possess the place of the glorious shepherd Peter, whose vicar you remain, and unfurl the standard of the Holy Cross. As we were set free by the cross, free us from war and division and from much iniquity. Liberate the unfaithful people from their infidelity." End quote. And eventually, in 1378, Gregory came. What ensued at Rome turned out not to be the triumphal return of a welcomed spiritual leader to the care of his flock, but a precipitous and cascading catastrophe, which Caterina lived only 2 more years to see the beginnings of. She died in 1380 at the age of 33. By the time that the papal cortege finally arrived at Rome in January 1377, Pope Gregory XI was an old and very sick man. Having barely established his court in the city, occupying its now dilapidated buildings, in March 1378 he died. The intervening months had witnessed excited expectations rising among the population and leaders of Rome. Their pope had returned. His death meant that everything was thrown up in the air once more. Would the Northerners, the College of Cardinals, rip from the city its just won prize? The city descended into riotous tumult. An air of intimidation prevailed, as those cardinals who were in Rome assembled at the Vatican in conclave, which is every Dan Brown with your nose means conclave, with key. The prefect of the city was requested to station troops on the bridges over the Tiber. The visiting cardinals removed their valuables to the protection of the Castel Sant'Angelo, which was held by a garrison of the dreaded and hated Breton papal mercenaries. The atmosphere was explosive. Just below the surface, an outbreak of physical violence was waiting to be triggered. The Roman populace chanted outside the basilica, "Romano lo volemo." We want a Roman. Some qualified this with un Italiano, an Italian. At one point, a false rumor swept through the crowd that a Roman cardinal had been elected, which was completely false. The mob broke into the basilica and riotously celebrated their victory. The conclave had to go along with the charade and not enlighten them for some time. When order had been restored, the conclave met again. It was clear that the opposing sides were the Limousin and what were called the Gallican faction, centered around the Butcher of Cesena, Archbishop Robert of Geneva. That is, the group we would see as French formed the 2 sides of a deep division. The Gallicans, being unable to get one of their own, lit upon the Archbishop of Bari, Bartolomeo Prignano, and won over 4 Italian and 1 of the Spanish cardinals. Prignano, as an outsider, whom they believed would be compliant, assumed the name of Urban VI. The Romans were mollified that at least an Italian had been chosen. The Limousins were defeated. For their safety, several of the Gallican delegates retreated into the Castel Sant'Angelo. Others went to Anagni, north of Rome. That left Prignano, the new Urban VI, sitting on the papal throne and fully intent not only on remaining in the Holy City, but on forthrightly reforming, by his own fiat and at a stroke, the abuses he saw in the College of Cardinals. This enraged the men who felt themselves intimidated into having elected him. Removed from the pressure of Rome, they regretted their decision, and soon they rescinded it. They declared the election null and void and proceeded ad fondi, September 1378, to elect a legitimate pope who was none other than the Archbishop of Geneva, Robert, who had held the office of Carmalegno of the Holy Roman Church. They called upon Urban to resign. He did nothing of the sort, but immediately called upon armed support from within Italy to counter the power of the Breton mercenaries, still under the command of Robert of Geneva, styling himself Clement VII. Urban, with support from the Roman militias, retired to Tivoli, east of Rome, for a better defence. On the 16th of July, 1378, the Bretons defeated the Roman militias at the Battle of Ponte Salario, at which 500 Romans were killed. On returning to Rome, the remnants of Urban's men set upon and killed as many foreigners in the city as they could lay hands on. Urban's call for aid was enthusiastically responded to by one of Hawkwood's understudies, mentioned above, Alberico da Barbiano, who came to his aid with his own exclusively Italian company. Clement VII was supported by the powerful and equally Italian Caetani and Orsini clans, and by the Count of Fondi. The 75-man strong Breton garrison under Clement's nephew, Bernardo da Sala, kept the Castel San Angelo under their control. Clement's militias based themselves to the south of Rome at Ciampino, the present-day second airport of the city. There, in April 1379, a clash occurred at Marino, which lasted but 5 hours, with the Breton cavalry being routed by the Compagnie di San Giorgio, the Company of St. George, the infantry company formed by the Romanian Condottiero. Alberico da Barbiano re-entered Rome in triumph and obtained from Urban VI a standard with the letters in gold, LITABEXT, signifying Italia ab exteris liberata, Italy liberated from the outsiders. Urban acted quickly, nominating 28 new cardinals at Rome, of whom 20 were from Italy. Clement VII fled to Gaeta and from there to Naples, where he was the guest of Queen Giovanna of Anjou. But the populace of Naples rose, and Clement had to flee back to Avignon. This split was not over any theological doctrine, and certainly not over nationalist identity, but over the location of the papacy, and it was over the nature of the pontifical constitution. At Avignon, the College of Cardinals, set up during the 11th century to bolster the independence of the papacy, had with time taken on an identity and an institutional interest of its own. Just as the Church over many centuries had preserved the ancient Roman concepts of power exercised under the advisement and with the consent of society's stakeholders, and had provided the model whereby the emerging principalities had evolved the institutions of the estates and parliaments, so now did this model exert its attraction concerning the papacy itself. The cardinals saw themselves as the co-rulers of Christendom, who shared their advice with the reigning pope and granted their consensual agreement to his policies. Theirs was an oligarchical concept, a model more at home in Avignon during the schism than it was at Rome. And at Avignon, Robert de Genève, Pope Clement VII, looked for support for his claims to legitimacy by moving into the orbit of the French king, Charles V, who recognized Clement as legitimate pope in November 1378, outlawing obedience to Urban VI for the church within his realms. This sealed the schism of the Latin Church, for accordingly each prince and sometimes each city took the side of one or other of the opposing popes, the criterion being used being political. Each power looked to its chief rival's choice of pope and then chose the opposing one. The split in Christendom had become systematized, politicized, and within the Church's structures, institutionalized. Several Swiss city bishoprics had for many years 2 opposed reigning bishops. Ecclesiastical law was thrown into complete confusion. Through which pope's judicial structure should one pursue one's case? Papal decrees were contradictory. And people on the ground took the matter extremely seriously. Johann Hautzinger tells us that When the town of Bruges went over to the obedience of Avignon, a great number of people left their house, trade, or prebend to go and live according to their party views in some dioceses of the urbanist obedience, such as Liège, Utrecht, or elsewhere. In 1382, the oriflamme, which might only be unfurled in a holy cause, was taken up against the Flemings because they were urbanists, that is, infidels. Pierre Salmon, a French political agent arriving at Utrecht about Easter, could not find a priest there willing to admit him to the communion service, quote, because they said I was a schismatic and believed in Benedict the antipope, end quote. The schism was deplored from all sides and at all levels. It was a standing scandal to the whole of Christendom, and it only deepened as the decades passed. It lasted some 40 years. And it gave free rein to the sense of disgust felt in some quarters for the whole edifice of the traditional church. We have already seen precursors of this in the persons of Dante, Marsilio di Padova, and Wycliffe. Wycliffe's followers in southern England had been noticed and prosecuted, or if you like, persecuted, by the normal mechanisms of social control, by the medieval Inquisition, as opposed to the early modern one. Lollardry, as it was called, was effectively suppressed. In 1410, a certain John Badby was tried and condemned by the diocesan court of St. Paul's at London and bound to the stake at Smithfield outside the city walls. The real young Prince Hal, or Henry, portrayed as frequenting taverns in Shakespeare's play Henry V, came forward at this moment and offered Badby both instant release and a life pension if he would recant his denial of the doctrine of transubstantiation. But as the chronicler reports, quote, the abandoned villain declined the prince's advice and chose rather to be burned than give reverence to the life-giving sacrament. So it befell that this mischievous fellow was burnt to ashes and died miserably in his sin, end quote. However, the schism opened up opportunities for religious revolt elsewhere. Conditions were ripe for the writings of Wycliffe to jump to the opposite side of Europe, to Prague in Bohemia, where a doctor of theology at the Charles University there, Johannes Huss, adopted the writings of Wycliffe and promulgated a swingeing criticism of the whole Christian hierarchy. The revolt of an academic theologian was, historically, a foretaste of what was to come over the following centuries. Europe's network of universities were coming to play a prominent role in doctrinal and ecclesiastical matters. The University of Paris operated now as a kind of court of high opinion on this or that church matter. The College of University Doctors could pronounce on such issues, and even individual learned doctors could pronounce on them also and gain an audience. Huss was one of the latter. At Prague, as elsewhere, the schism provided a vector for factionalism to harden. King Václav was lobbied by the faction-ridden doctors of the university, who were split by the issue of which antipope to be loyal to, and by what we would call ethnic divisions. Like all the great medieval universities, many of the students and professors were non-Czech and organized themselves as naciones, nations in the medieval sense. These were broad regional categories of students of similar origin. At Prague, these naciones were the Bohemians, the locals, the Saxons, the Poles, and the Bavarians. Modern Czech history is capable of seeing only through a retrospectively selective optic of encroaching Germans versus native Czechs. That the Saxon and Bavarian nationes understood one another as distinct and as foreign to one another escapes that modern view. And the energetic activity of the Polish nacio at Prague is generally absent from the picture. In 1409, to secure the backing of the University of Prague, King Václav issued a decree depriving the majority of the doctors who supported the Roman antipope, and who were speakers of the German and Polish vernaculars, of their control, and bestowed it on their rivals, those who used the Czech vernacular. Huss was prominent among the latter. The result was the resignation of Archbishop Zbigniew, who supported anti-pope Alexander V and who had ordered, against the king's wishes, the public burning of Huss's books by Wycliffe in the courtyard of his bishop's residence. This multifaceted conflict also precipitated the exodus of the Saxon and Bavarian naciones from Prague to establish an alternative new university at Leipzig. Without a head, the diocesan supervision of the city's religious life fell into abeyance. Huss gave over 3,000 sermons in the Bethlehem Chapel in Prague. When the legates of anti-pope John XXII arrived in 1412 to preach a crusade against their papal rivals in Italy, the scandal was so flagrant in Huss's eyes that he openly preached against them, for which he was excommunicated. Huss's position was that a priest in a state of sin could not exercise the powers, plentitudine potestatis, of his sacred office. This applied to the prelates, cardinals, and to the Pope himself. Quote, "If also the Pope, cardinals, and other prelates and clergy who are cupidous, avaricious, and luxurious, and do not behave appropriately as priests of Christ, these are the officials, priests, and popes of demons, and of the worst Antichrist, and not true priests of Christ." End quote. The tendency towards a kind of polarizing Manichaean extremism, evident in Huss's language, was to become an increasingly marked feature of the religious imagination, both official and rebellious, as the 1400s progressed. It was not to be a helpful development.